Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Green College resident member talk. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're assembled at the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. My name is Roy. I'm one of the members here at Green College. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Aaron. Aaron holds a master's from Ohio State University, and then he has joined UBC recently to pursue a PhD. Aaron today is going to talk about how maintaining biodiversity is critical for our sustenance and existence, and what happens when extreme human activities challenge that fine balance we've got and challenges our ecosystem. So he'll talk about biodiversity crisis. So without further ado, please welcome Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Roy, and thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking about the biodiversity crisis and why it's important for the diversity of life on Earth and also for humanity. Roy already gave a wonderful land acknowledgement, but I just wanted to add to also honor the indigenous ways of knowing and sustainably relating to nature and to the land. And in particular, I wanted to give a little quick shout out to the Museum of Vancouver, which has a really cool exhibit right now that's called That Which Sustains Us. And it's basically just about how the indigenous cultures of this area related to nature in a sustainable fashion. Okay, so today I'm going to start by outlining the biodiversity crisis and why we should care, the major threats to biodiversity, the tools that conservation biologists have at their disposal, and the necessary changes that society needs to make as well as us as individuals need to make in order to prevent the further decay of our ecosystems and biodiversity. So to start, I want to just define biodiversity. The short and sweet definition is all life on Earth. So from unicellular organisms to plants, fungi, vertebrates, including humans, nematodes, and some groups that you may never have heard of, like the tardigrades. So really from the microbes to the mammoths, as they say. And another fundamental question is, how much life is there on Earth? And so it sounds like it's a simple question, but it's actually got a little bit more of a nuanced answer. Scientists have identified 1.2 million species, but it turns out it's actually really hard to find and identify all life on Earth, especially those that are microscopic or have really reduced ranges or live in places that are inaccessible, like inside of other organisms or into the depths of the ocean. So essentially, using patterns of biodiversity across different groups of organisms, scientists have been able to estimate the amount of biodiversity on Earth, and the best estimate we have currently is about 8.7 million species. And so it always amazes me that we've probably only actually been able to quantify about 1/7 of the diversity that's likely on our very own planet. So scientists have also estimated that throughout Earth's long 4.56 billion year history, that there have been as many as 4 billion species that have inhabited this Earth. And so obviously 8.7 million today, 4 billion throughout history. The cast of species has been far from static throughout that time. And so species are constantly going extinct and new species are being formed through evolution and ultimately through speciation. And so this figure here is an evolutionary tree of hominids or near humans. And all of these branches that don't reach out to the present, so here you can see is the present, all of those species have actually gone extinct. And so as you know, just just us that remains along with our primate relatives. So there have been certain moments in Earth's history, though, when the cast of life has changed really rapidly. And in particular, there have been 5 mass extinctions when 75% of the world's species have been lost in a short amount of geological time. And so remember, as I mentioned, Earth has been around for 4.56 billion years, so a short amount of geological time can still be on the scale of millions of years. And so I want to zoom into one of the most famous extinctions, the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, 66 million years ago, the end of all dinosaurs except for birds. And in this particular extinction, we lost 75% of life on Earth. And so what happened? We know now that a 10 to 15 kilometer asteroid slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, creating a dust cloud that likely prevented photosynthesis and caused freezing temperatures. And so I want to just give another quick shout out here to Science World, which has a pretty cool exhibit right now called The Ultimate Predator, the T-Rex. And so part of what I thought was really cool about that exhibit is I'd always thought the T-Rex was just one species of dinosaur, right? But it turns out there's a whole big genus of dinosaurs called Tyrannus. And so you can see here, these are all, this is a photo I took, these are all different species of tyrannosaurs. So humans obviously weren't around 66 million years ago. How do we know that that mass extinction happened? So essentially, species leave records through fossils of their existence. And so, a species is going to appear through time, and then eventually, if it stops appearing, that suggests that it's gone extinct. And so through that, they've been able to identify these 5 mass extinctions, and importantly, also quantify what's known as the background extinction rate. So outside of those 5 major extinctions, as I said, Earth's cast of species is always changing, right? Species are always going extinct. So what's the rate that species are going extinct outside of those mass extinctions? And that's super important for putting today's extinction rates into context. So this figure shows the extinction rates of 5 groups of vertebrates. And you can see it's pretty clear that down here is the background rate of extinction. So this is the number or the percentage of species that we would have expected to have been driven extinct under background. And then these are the actual cumulative percentage of species that have gone extinct. And so scientists estimate that the extinction rates that we're seeing today are between 100 and 1,000 times higher than background. And so just to kind of make that a little more concrete, since 1900, under background rates of extinction, we would have expected 9 species to go extinct, and scientists conservatively estimate that 477 species have gone extinct. But it turns out it's really challenging to say that a species is extinct in the wild. So according to the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, a species is extinct in the wild when there's no reasonable doubt that the last individual member has died. And so just to give an example, up until the 1990s, a species had to go over 50 years without being seen to be declared extinct. So these species extinctions are obviously evidence that things are out of whack, we're way above normal. But to me, the more damning or the more convincing evidence lies in the overall declines in abundance that we're witnessing. So this figure here just shows basically the amounts or the overall abundances that we've lost. We're witnessing 70% declines, and so wildlife was about 3 times as abundant back in 1970 as it is today. And it's not just endangered species or really rare species. You can see that overall for land vertebrates that over 30% of the species that are declining are actually classified as low concern by the IUCN. And so it just goes to show that these declines are really widespread across all taxonomic groups. And for some groups like birds here, even 50, over 50% of the species that are declining are listed as of low concern. So why do we care? Well, I'm going to show you a short clip illustrating one of the reasons that I care. Oh no! I don't know what to say about that.
Can you press escape and shift your screen to the other screen?
Good thinking, good thinking. Good thinking, Merlin.
Attracting the perfect partner is a challenge for all male birds of paradise. To attract a female, looking good is only half the story. To seal the deal, he must get creative and dazzle her with his performance. He really catches the eye. Who wouldn't be impressed with these moves? Okay, it's not exactly swan lake, but it works.
Okay, so I think we're probably all in agreement that birds are really beautiful. They have incredible plumages or feathers. They have fascinating behaviors, and they really inspire awe. And so to me, just the intrinsic value of biodiversity is worth conserving. But there's also a more utilitarian argument that can be made. This figure here shows ways that nature benefits humans through what are called ecosystem services. And so just to give a few examples, biodiversity aids in nutrient cycling, pollination, procuration of medicine, spiritual and recreational opportunities, as well as our water and food. So to further illustrate this, I'm just going to share an example at the intersection of India's cattle ranching sector and Earth's most effective cleanup crew, the vultures. So vultures are scavengers, and they help with the timely breakdown of organic materials when other animals die. So essentially, nutrient cycling and disease regulation. And so in the early 2000s, biologists began to notice that populations of India's vultures were declining precipitously across all these species here. And so they sampled these corpses, and they found lethal levels of a veterinary drug called diclofenac, which is essentially an anti-inflammatory drug that cattle ranchers were actually administering to their cows. And so then if a cow died and it, not in the slaughterhouse, the vultures would come down and start doing what they do best, and they were receiving these lethal doses of this anti-inflammatory drug. And so with the decline in vultures, that opened up this niche, that scavenging opportunity, and what happened was feral dogs came in and began scavenging on the corpses of the cows. And ultimately, what we saw was an increase in rabies, which resulted in 48,000 human rabies deaths and about $34 billion, a cost of $34 billion to the Indian economy from 1992 to 2006. So that all just goes to show that changes in biodiversity can have real ramifications for public health and also for our economies. Okay, so far I've outlined the biodiversity crisis and discussed why it's important. Jaya gave us an in-depth look at one really important threat to biodiversity a couple weeks ago, overfishing. And I'm going to turn to the BBC and Sir David Attenborough to highlight a few other threats.
Over the course of my life, I've encountered some of the...
There are many ways to remove pieces of the puzzle. The most obvious way is to kill something, and we do a lot of that.
We're talking about millions of animals being snatched from the wild, from thousands of species.
We have massive and widespread overfishing.
We've completely destroyed the natural balance of fish in the world's oceans.
When I was a kid in the 1960s, there were 3 billion people in the world. And I'm now probably going to see it actually reach, 9 billion in my lifetime, which is pretty startling.
Population growth is much, much higher in the developing world than in the developed.
But it's problematic just to talk about population, because there are two things which are going on. It's population, but it's also consumption.
And in terms of impact on the planet, what's much more important is the growth in consumption levels. And these are far higher in the developed economies.
While in a country like the United Kingdom, where some very strong laws on how to reduce pollution, we do have to realise we're no longer a major industrial country. Most of the things that we actually use are produced abroad in countries where the laws can be non-existent. So we're simply moving our footprint on destroying nature to another country.
Many people imagine there's this untouched wilderness because they see it on their TV screens. But the reality is, there's really not a lot of wild left out there.
We've converted 75% of the land that is not covered by ice.
3/4 of the terrestrial surface has been changed, a lot of it just to feed one species.
All of the calculations show we're on track for a 3 to 4 degree world. And the more the Earth warms, the worse the problem is.
There are lots of ways that climate change will impact on species. These are no longer predictions, we're seeing it happen.
Are you guys able to hear that back there? Okay, cool. I think it's coming out of my computer, not... Cool, so some pretty scary stuff in my opinion. And I'm going to take just a second to expand on a few additional points there. So, at one point they're talking about overconsumption. And I just wanted to highlight that in terms of ecological footprint, they're talking to all of us right here in this room. It's these darker shades of purple are the highest ecological footprint. So, all of us, Roy, you're not getting out of this one either. Australia, they're talking to us. We really need to change. I think our ways of consumption, really overconsumption, and so yeah, it's definitely relevant for us. And then they talked in the video about how climate change impacts nature, but I also just wanted to highlight that nature impacts climate change, right? So as we lose biodiversity, we release CO2, and we also so that obviously exacerbates climate change, right? The more carbon dioxide that's going into the environment, and we also lose the resilience or our ability to handle a changing climate. So really kind of a dangerous positive feedback loop there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that conservation biologists have available to them to try to stop or prevent further loss of biodiversity. And in terms of actually altering or preventing the alteration of landscapes, there's I mean, it's not an exhaustive list, but I'm going to talk about 3 of the principal options here. And so traditionally, the cornerstone of conservation efforts lied in protecting areas with high biodiversity. And so I think the national park system of the United States and Canada is a really good example of that. This is one of my favorite parks, Yosemite National Park in the Sierra Nevadas of California. But more recently, we're doing a better job of recognizing that biodiversity is found outside of these formally protected areas as well, including through the establishment of OECMs, which stand for Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures. And so these are essentially areas that have high conservation value, but their primary objective doesn't necessarily need to be conservation. And so, that's in direct contrast with the protected areas that I just talked about. And so examples of these can be set-asides within agricultural systems, conserved water catchments, locally managed marine areas, and other high conservation value areas and they can span across public lands, private lands, community lands, and I think importantly, indigenous lands. And so I think a lot of this initiative actually comes from the recognition that indigenous peoples in general have sustainably managed their lands for centuries. So studies show that indigenous lands are more effective at preventing deforestation and actually house higher levels of biodiversity in many instances compared to strictly protected areas. And then to compound that, so I want to zoom in right here on this part of this figure. To compound that, much of the remaining natural habitat left on Earth lies on indigenous people's lands. So it's critical to officially recognize the importance of these lands, which can help leverage funding and work directly with these indigenous groups to ensure the continued protection of these landscapes. Okay, so another option is habitat restoration. This photo here on the left, you see a mining site, or what was a mining site, and then by planting native vegetation, the idea is that you can restore natural processes and we're able to recover ecosystems. It's never going to be exactly identical to what it was previously, but the idea is to try to get something at least that resembled what the ecosystem originally looks like. And then finally, these coupled human-natural systems. So essentially the idea here is to try to make the spaces that we do inhabit and that we do impact more biodiversity friendly. So here in this bottom left-hand corner, got an image of Manhattan, and you guys can imagine there's not going to be a whole lot of habitat there for much wildlife. And to contrast that, this is kind of a futuristic eco-city where vegetation and habitat is really integrated into the structure and the design of the city. And then again, this is kind of the current approach to agriculture, right? This super intensified monoculture approach, and so we've really homogenized the landscape through agriculture. And when you homogenize the landscape, you also homogenize the biodiversity, not surprisingly, so that you see the same reduced set of species occurring over and over again with the broad-scale landscape transformation that's happened with the monocultural approach to agriculture. And so in contrast to that, you could have a polyculture system where there's higher biodiversity of actual crops as well as greater biodiversity of wildlife, because there's going to be more habitat in those systems. And if you couple that with actually sparing some more natural vegetation in that landscape, you can actually increase ecosystem services, right? So for example, the pollination that I mentioned earlier, and it can actually be kind of these win-win situations both for biodiversity and for agriculture. And so I want to just highlight one particular form of agroforestry that I am actually going to be working with during my PhD. It's called, these are called silvopastoral systems, and essentially they incorporate productive trees and shrubs into grazing landscapes, cattle ranching systems. And so you can see the pretty extreme transformation, right? This is an example of a traditional or a monocultural cattle farming approach. And here's what these silvopastoral systems can look like, right? And so it's not hard to guess which one's going to harbor more biodiversity. But again, the thing I want to highlight is that these silvopastoral systems have been shown to be more productive systems as well. So cows put on weight faster, produce more milk, and stocking rates are actually higher in these systems. So you can have more cows for a given area. Okay, so those are kind of the three main approaches that I'm going to cover in terms of actually altering the landscape or preventing the alteration of the landscape. But conservation is also, much more than that. There's lots of policy implementations as well that are important for conservation, and a lot of these happen at the level of individual species. And so I think the most emblematic example of that in North America is the Endangered Species Act. And essentially what happens here is that a species of conservation concern, it goes through a review process and is listed if it meets a certain set of criteria. And so what that means is that it can receive protection and, importantly, funding from the Endangered Species Act.
We're talking US.
Yes. And so this has been a real conservation success story. It's actually had a 99% success rate in preventing extinctions of animals that have been listed. So of over 1,700 species that have been listed, only 4 have gone extinct. There's another about 20 that have possibly gone extinct, but it's still not confirmed. And importantly, about 300 species are predicted to have gone extinct without the interventions of the Endangered Species Act. And so while this has been a real success story, I kind of want to pump the brakes a second and also just say that it's really expensive and a time-intensive approach to conservation, right? And very targeted, it's literally on a per-species basis. And so bringing it back to one of the very first slides I showed, there's 7.5 million species that we haven't even described yet. So how is a piece of legislation like this going to benefit biodiversity at large? And I want to dive into this a little more with one specific example, the Kirtlands Warbler. And beautiful little bird, beautiful little songbird. And so this right here shows the Kirtland Warbler's range. You can see it's very fragmented, and essentially in the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada. And this species was federally listed as endangered in 1973. But key part of this story is also about another bird, the brown-headed cowbird. And this bird makes its living in a really interesting way. It's a brood parasite, and so what that means is that they actually lay their eggs in the nests of other songbirds and then disappear. So the ultimate deadbeat dad or deadbeat mom story here. But importantly, we've gotten lots of wonderful photos of little tiny songbirds feeding these massive cowbird chicks. So that's, at least one positive that's come from this. And so the Kirtlands Warbler was listed in 1973, right? And so conservation biologists recognized that this was a big part of their declines. Birds that have cowbirds in their nests tend to fledge much fewer young, so they're not able to reproduce at levels to keep up with mortality. And so as part of the Endangered Species Act, what they did was come in and remove these cowbirds from the areas where there were known Kirtlands Warbler populations. But I want to take one step back and just kind of taking a look at this range map here. This is the range map of the brown-headed cowbird. And so up until the 1800s, this was where you found brown-headed cowbirds, right? Kind of in the Midwestern U.S. and up through the prairie pothole region. And then as we began to transform the landscape so heavily, but particularly through agriculture and the fragmentation of forests, the cowbird expanded to all the rest of that territory. And so you can see here is the Great Lakes, right, where the Kirtlands Warbler resides. And so the only reason that the brown-headed cowbirds were there in the first place was because of our transformation of the landscape, mostly through agriculture and fragmentation of forest. And so to me, this kind of feels like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, and at that, it's very expensive and time-intensive. And so I know I've kind of just bashed this piece of legislation, but I want to say these efforts are still really critical. Like without them, we, like I said, we would have probably lost 300 species of those that were listed just in the United States. And so this is really important for halting the immediate loss of biodiversity, but I think it illustrates that we're not necessarily addressing the root of the problem in many cases. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that, we're failing as a conservation community. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is kind of the premier, where the premier group of conservation biologists and politicians get together and talk about the state of biodiversity. And so they meet yearly, but once every 10 years, they come together and they actually talk about the state of biodiversity and they come up with targets for the next decade. So in 2010, the Convention on Biological Diversity met in Japan and decided on 20 targets that fall under 5 strategic goals, which you can see here. And the specifics of each target and goal aren't critical. The key is that their aim is to protect biodiversity in all instances. So in 2020, they met again, right? And how'd we do a decade later? Well, for those of you who said we're humans and we didn't do anything, you're spot on. Yeah, it was really touted as a big failure. We literally met 0 of the 20 biodiversity targets in full, and we partially met partially hit 6 of the 20 biodiversity targets. So I think, there's kind of widespread agreement that our approaches to biodiversity conservation aren't really working currently. And this was just a funny little anecdote here. I'm reading about, the Aichi biodiversity targets, and then I get this ad for a Black Friday sale, and to me, it's just kind of illustrative of what we're up against here. Okay, I'm gonna return to Sir David Attenborough to just outline some of the key solutions here.
For those of us who care about the future of our planet, we have to look at our lifestyles and we can't look away from our own behaviours.
40 years ago, people consumed a good deal less in the United Kingdom. But there is no evidence that we were unhappier then than we are now.
We can be more diligent about thinking about what we're consuming and when.
It's really digging down, saying what's going on here? Where does that come from?
You need to think about meat and dairy consumption.
That's not to say that none of us should ever eat meat or should cut all dairy out of our diets, but we have to demand that they are produced sustainably. We also need to start producing affordable food without expanding any further into the forest. This is indeed quite possible. One of the biggest problems is incredible. We actually waste about 40% of the food that is produced. If we could reduce that food waste, it would go a long, long way to making a more sustainable agricultural system.
It's not just about our current lifestyle, but about the education of our children on the way nature works.
If we don't act now, the youth of today and the youth of tomorrow are going to look back on this generation with absolute horror. What were you thinking?
We have a moment when we can change our world and make it better. This is that moment.
I do truly believe that together we can create a better future.
Okay, so Sir David Attenborough is confident. I know I've given a pretty depressing talk so far, but I'm also confident that we can turn the curve on biodiversity loss if we take action now. And so I wanted to just add on a few additional things, and maybe some things that hopefully feel a little more tractable at the level of the individual. And I've kind of organized these by, in my opinion, what the most important things are and the things that can make the biggest difference. So yeah, I'm going to start there. So the first one I have here is get out and vote. If these issues are important to you, take the time to do the research and try to understand the politicians' positions on climate change and on biodiversity and the conservation of nature at both your local level and at the national level. Additionally, they did kind of touch on this in the video, but put your money where your mouth is. So this right here is a pretty cool initiative that came out of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. That's actually a certification that you can find on coffee, on certain coffee brands, and so it's basically, yeah, it's called Bird Friendly Certified, and it's all about habitat for wildlife. Coffee was actually meant to be grown in the shade, and so it was it's a good opportunity to incorporate native tree species into those systems, and so they certify farmers that have a certain level of tree cover in their coffee farms. Third thing I have here is keep your cats indoors. So cats, as cute as they may be, it's estimated that they kill between 1.3 and 4 billion birds in the United States alone each year. And it's not just birds, right? It's small mammal, all vertebrates and even some large insects. They have millions of years of evolution on their side that have honed those immaculate hunting skills. Fourth, participate in citizen science. And I think this is a fun one too. I put my favorite citizen science app up there. It's called eBird, and essentially what you do is, if you are outside and you notice any species of birds, you can start a checklist and you can record the species that you see and also the number of individuals of that species. You submit your checklist and it gets uploaded to a central database at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and all that data is publicly available, and there have been some amazing papers using eBird data with this new understanding of when and how birds are distributed throughout the annual cycle. And so there have been some really cool conservation-oriented papers that have come out of these citizen science data sets. Next one is grow gardens, not lawns. It's pretty similar to what I was mentioning earlier about the polycultural approach to agriculture. You have more biodiversity of plant species, and then you create also habitat for wildlife that way. You can imagine a a single species of grass for a lawn is not going to create very much habitat. And then these last two, everyone's heard a million times, so I'm not going to harp on them too much, but reduce, reuse, recycle in that order. So best is if you can reduce your consumption. If you have purchased something or you're using something, try to reuse it. And then the third best option is to recycle. And then be mindful of your water use. Try to take reasonable showers, turn off the water as you're brushing your teeth, and same with the lights if you're not actually in the room. Okay, so I know it's been kind of a downer of a talk, but I do think we can bend the curve on biodiversity loss. But like I said, only with massive action across all these different areas that I've mentioned. So just to walk you through this figure here, this gray line, represents what's going to happen to biodiversity if we continue business as usual. The yellow or gold line is if we increase conservation efforts alone. And what they mean by conservation efforts is just the strict protection of natural places and the restoration of degraded places. And then to actually get our biodiversity back up to historic levels, we not only need increased conservation, but everything that we were just talking about, more sustainable production, and that every one of us also does our part and is a more sustainable consumer. So I promise I'm stepping off my soapbox here. And yeah, just wanted to give a shout out to an initiative that the Sustainability Committee is promoting, and I think hopefully in combination with the Reading Room Committee to watch some documentaries that can give a little bit more background on all these issues. So if you are interested in learning more about this stuff, I think there will be opportunities coming up for that. And I just want to end with this quote by E.O. Wilson. Biodiversity is the totality of all inherited variation in the life forms of Earth, of which we are but one species. We study and save it to our great benefit. We ignore and degrade it to our great peril. So, yeah, thank you very much, and happy to take any questions if I still have any time.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Aaron, for the great presentation. Please excuse my voice. When you look at some of the trends, visuals, and videos, it certainly makes you reflect, doesn't it, that we are so privileged to have a nature that nurtures us, but then it also forces you to think, like, what are we doing to protect it? So again, a great talk, Aaron. We have about 10 minutes. I'd love to take some questions, so if you have any questions, please, yep, we've got some. I'll come to you first. And I'd encourage if you can keep your questions short and crisp, that'll be great. Thank you.
Hi, Aaron. I forget what you called it exactly, but the pastoral wildering thing about dairy farming. Since it seems to be economically beneficial, et cetera, good for the cows, everything else, why isn't there an uptake of that in Western countries at least? Haven't seen anything about it in New Zealand. I was wondering.
Yeah. So I think, I guess I'm mostly familiar with that particular system in more tropical countries, and they've done a lot of pilot pilot deployments of that in certain tropical countries in Latin America. And so that's where all that data is coming from, and it's been a big success. But I think one of the things they've learned is it's really challenging to convince farmers who have been doing agriculture the same way for a really long time. This was how my father did it. This was how his father did it. And especially a lot of these people are kind of living day to day on the margin. So it's really risky for them to try out this new system. It's their livelihood. It's being able to feed their family that's at stake, and they know they can do it. barely getting by if they stick with what they know, and the other options a lot more of an unknown. The other thing is it's knowledge intensive, so you have to have a lot. You have to have I guess you have to know how to implement that system, and it's more intensive in terms of the management side. Like you have to rotate the cattle a lot more between paddocks, and it's startup costs. You gotta have money to buy trees, buy fencing, and so yeah, I think there's a number of reasons that is at least true in Latin America. I'm not as familiar with other places though.
Thanks, Aaron. So I guess for context, my name is Ben. I work for Agriculture Canada. And so we're always trying to convince farmers to choose different tactics, best management practices when it comes to emissions, and all sorts of initiatives that are beneficial for society as a whole. And if I've learned one thing is that if you have the right financial incentives for farmers, they will uptake new methods quickly. And I know for the civil pastoral systems, they can be financially incentivized with like voluntary carbon emissions pricing. Like companies who want to offset their emissions will pay for those farmers to have trees grown on their pastoral lands, and the whole system becomes kind of there's a real incentive for the forestry to happen. But it seems like there's I guess I have a question is like how can more of these systems become financially viable for farmers? Because if it's always going to be a cut to how to yields to how much land farmers can harvest at once, like those types of initiatives are tough to move forward. So do you have any other suggestions other than this civil pastoral one? Because there's a lot of different types of agriculture that might not be able to help.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I agree that it's about the economics in terms of getting people on board. So I guess one thing I'll say is my advisor just took part in this huge meta-analysis looking at productivity of agricultural systems and then comparing those with more sustainable approaches to agriculture, and they found no net effect overall of, like across hundreds of studies, they found no net effect on productivity. But I do think it's challenging because there can be increases as well, right? Like you might have less land in production, but maybe you're getting additional ecosystem services or whatever else. But I think it can be challenging to convince a farmer that that's true. So I guess another initiative that is going on in my lab is like trying to prioritize which lands you might take out of production. And so there's always going to be certain lands within a given farm that are more productive and certain lands that are less productive. And so if you target your restoration efforts or whatever kind of biodiversity goals you're aiming for in those less productive lands, you can also kind of have a smaller impact again on productivity. But I think you're right with like the incentive programs and actually paying people. I think that's like a really promising approach, and I think that's maybe, at least in our system in Colombia, I think that was probably the most effective way, was to say, look, here's 8 billion Colombian pesos. Yeah, so.
Thanks, Aaron. Who's next?
Thank you for the great talk with so many cute bird photos. I love it. I have a question about convincing people. So I often find that those beautiful, really informative documentaries, these presentations, they are often attended by people who already care. And for instance, like, you talked about reduce, reuse, recycle. For instance, like a green college, most people really care about, how they sort out the waste and whatnot. But like when one person tosses out their plastic garbage and, for instance, compost, and it's gone, right? The whole batch is just basically meaningless, right? And like, for instance, for politicians, like, I have seen a lot of politicians who really, like, who know about this thing, but like who prioritize other economical or more, employment related like policies and whatnot over environmental conservation. And I was wondering, like, what kind of practices have been there, if you're aware, like to, for instance, like convince these people who are not necessarily, willing to reach out for information, or like, who have like different opinions, or who prioritize other things over environmental conservation.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point and a good question. I think it's really challenging, and I think it's maybe more challenging in today's super polarized climate and in today's world where people don't believe in science, people don't necessarily, there's no truth anymore. So it's really challenging to say, like, no, look at the data, it's right here. Like, it's clear that, that doesn't necessarily like work anymore. So I think it is really a tough issue. I guess again, I can best speak to like Colombia, and I think most of what happened there was like they had this initial pilot season where I think it was mostly really big farms that like said, all right, yeah, we'll try this. Like, you guys are about to give us all these free tree. Like, you guys are basically giving us everything, so we'll try it. And then after like 5 years, these farms, the trees started growing, and so the farms started looking pretty different. And what they did, because most people were super skeptical, like when they tried to recruit a broader percentage of the population, most people were like, no chance am I, going to stray from what I know. And then they brought the people to these demonstration farms and said, no, but check it out. Look what your neighbor Juan is doing, or whatever. And then they were convinced, and by talking, the word of mouth, right? Like, so they talked to the owners of those farms, so instead of hearing it from some third party that like you don't really necessarily know, you don't know if you should trust them or not, I think if you can hear it from someone that you do trust. But I know that's like a very specific example, and I think the broader question is super valid, and I don't have like a really great answer for your broader question. Yeah.
All right, we have the last couple of minutes. AJ has a question, and then Merlin, if someone has, again, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Aaron, thanks so much for the presentation. I found it very engaging and very accessible. My question was, you mentioned like locally or even on a national level, like we can be mindful of who we're voting for as like a way to address like the decrease in biodiversity and having more like prioritizing conservation. But it's very much like a global problem too, right? Like the decreasing biodiversity. So I was interested in, is there initiatives happening right now, or like how do you think it could be incentivized like more on like a global scale, where often like the economic incentive kind of takes priority?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess my thought is like the global scale is still made up of all these individual countries coming together. And so, for example, like the International Panel on Climate Change meets And, everyone basically, they all get together and they try to agree on certain goals and agree on, make promises essentially of look, we're gonna do this because this is an important problem. And so when Donald Trump was president, I can't remember exactly whether they just no-showed the whole convention or what, but they basically said, no, we're not changing our behavior. We're going to continue doing what we want. And so if the United States bows out, one of the biggest greenhouse gas producers and biggest consumers bows out of this huge 195 nation agreement that is totally at a global scale, it sends a really poor message to the rest of the world. And so I think I guess I don't have a super great answer other than I do think who you vote for at these smaller scales ultimately make up the global community that comes together to try to target or to try to combat these problems.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, AJ.
Yeah.
Really important actually on the more local scale to message your MPs, and our MP for our area is Joyce Marie. You can literally email them and ask them to do anything, and if they hear enough emails saying, hey, I really want more biodiversity action or climate change action, then they actually will, because they want to do whatever we want them to do. Email Joyce Marie.
Thanks, Ella. A short question from Merlin.
Maybe not a question, but what would be interesting is the North American continent had long not the human species living.
Sorry?
On there. So on the North American continent, we did not have the human species living on there for many millions of years.
Yeah.
So how this is interesting is mathematically, now you introduce a species, and now what does it make, or what does it do with the other species? And when we understand this more properly, we may be able to find ways to see which exact species we should focus on and how. Of course, there's not much data around in the early years, and we also have not much data about this background extinction rate, which is basically the natural selection, I guess. And so this would be interesting, I think, to study really when humans came. First, of course, the indigenous people who had a better way to deal with other species than the other people who came then after. But this would be interesting on a foundational maybe level. Or what do you think?
Yeah, I think ecology is pretty much all math, as you saw from my textbook that I understood nothing of, because it's too much math. So no, I think that's right. I mean, definitely taking a mathematical approach to all these problems is super important. So yeah, I agree.
And that is the field of community ecology, is all calculus on different interactions.
Yeah.
Thanks, Merlin. We're slightly out of time, but I'll allow one final question from Alicia.
I'll make it quick. Hi, Aaron. Thanks for the eye-opening presentation. I think this work is very noble. And I found the human nature systems to be very interesting. And I was wondering if you could just briefly speak on how effective the community level interventions are. You spoke of what we can do on an individual level. But the image that you had on the top left, where you have this building with green spaces kind of integrated within it, I've always been curious with how effective is that really, and where is the line where these sort of buildings will go into greenwashing? If
I don't
you know what I mean. The idea is that it looks really good and it looks very eco-friendly, but what is it actually doing? How is that affecting the number of species in that community, for example?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, I think, So those kind of, yeah, the human natural systems, I do think one caveat there is that like you tend to get still the most kind of generalist species that take advantage of those systems. So, you know, maybe in a city, instead of just having rock pigeons, you know, you might get 15 or 20 species. And I think overall, like, that still helps biodiversity, and especially recovering some of those abundance trends. But you're not going to get, like, the harpy eagle in the middle of, you know, Rio de Janeiro or something. So it's like there's still other species that are never going to, like, be able to utilize those types of habitats. So yeah, I think it's really depends a lot kind of on the species, the specific species. And I think it's still, I don't think scientists really know, like, at a landscape level, like if we transformed, you know, millions of hectares to these more biodiversity friendly approaches to agriculture and cities, what that could do at like a massive scale. I mean, there's no examples of that, so it's hard to know. All we know is that at the small scale, when it does happen, generally it's the species that are you know, a little bit better able to exploit modified landscapes in the first place that tend to show up there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. All right.
Sorry?
What's the good stuff?
Of what? Sorry?
What is the good stuff?
For biodiversity?
Rooftop gardens?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I think they can all have an impact, but I guess anywhere that's like still superhuman modified is not going to have like the full species community. So I guess what I would say is like you need both protected areas, strictly protected areas. You need large, you know, reserves, and I shouldn't say strictly protected, but you need large areas where the natural landscape is intact for a lot of species, and then, in my opinion, these other approaches to like more friendly urban landscapes or more friendly agriculture, they can, you know, be movement corridors for species to move between these the more intact ecosystems, or obviously they can also be home to a subset of species. So yeah, I think it helps, but I think it all helps and is all really important.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Thanks again for everyone turning up. If you have any questions, you can see him now for a couple of minutes. You have his email address on the screen. You also have his Twitter handle. Twitter may go extinct, keeping up with the theme of today's presentation. So not sure, but you can certainly email him. Thanks again for turning up today. And we'll gather again next week. And if you want to know who's presenting, turn up next Monday, 8 o'clock, and you'll find out. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. And please thank Aaron.